Hello everyone, welcome back to another exciting video for the BioWar series. Today we are going back to the bits you love, technology. With the success of Julia and Seas of Glory, I felt it was time to talk more about the naval situation in BioWar. We have a fair bit to cover today, so rather than waffling on, I'm going to get straight into the content. Using a mixture of naval art and some of my limited drawing skills, I'm going to be showing you some of the other unique vessels of the BioWar timeline, as well as some of the technology they use. I should warn you, this is not historically accurate, and I have made significant changes to real historical events in order to make these ships work. However, I've tried to be as realistic as possible. Alright then, let's get started. To begin with, let's talk about some weapons. As experimentation on reverse-engineered V2 rockets continued, Allied researchers conducted many experiments on different types of missile. The XG-47 was considered the grandfather of the later SM-64, sharing a very similar outward appearance. Using a detachable booster, the XG-47 was deployed from a ramp that could be mounted on a platform or ship. Once up to the correct speed and altitude, mounted ramjets would then take over, propelling the missile to Mach 1.9 at around 45,000 to 55,000 feet. Guided by gyroscopes and delayed radio command guidance, the 900 kg high explosive warhead would then detonate on impact with the ground. These missiles saw limited use during the retreat to Paris in early 1947, being primarily launched from the HMS Rodney, which had been converted to fire the experimental missiles in 1946. 15th of May 1947 marked the first time two of these missiles were fired simultaneously from Rodney's deck, guided by both the HMS Rodney and the HMS Jamaica. Designed as the first British surface-to-air missile, the Lopwing was considered the grandfather of the Sea Slug missile. Radar beam riding guidance and a flak warhead, these missiles were relatively slow, but packed a punch when they detonated. Several ships were refitted to test these, most notably the HMS Jamaica and JDS Tone, which were armed with a single launch rail and double launch rail respectively. With a speed of Mach 0.9, these missiles could reach a maximum height of 33,000 feet, ideal for targeting high and slow bomber formations. One of the only real weapons on the list today, the Little Joe is an early surface-to-air missile developed by the Americans. Originally designed to counter kamikaze attacks, in BioWar, these missiles see a great deal of use on board US Navy vessels. With a top speed of 400 miles per hour and radio command guidance, these missiles are cheap but effective compared to the British Lopwings. With German engineers evacuated to Allied and Soviet nations after the bioweapon outbreak, many of the designs created by the Germans found their way into Soviet and Allied hands. As early as March 1945, Allied and Soviet researchers had reverse-engineered and begun production of copied V1 and V2 rockets, making modifications and redesignating the designs. Soviet-built 10kh missiles were initially only capable of being launched from aircraft, but were later modified to be launched from ships using various types of rails and catapults. Allied engineers, meanwhile, had much more success, with the Americans creating the JB-2. The licence for these was immediately purchased by the British, named the Westlander JB-2. Though mostly launched from the British coast, some American ships were modified with launch rails in order to extend the range of these new missiles. Okay, so exciting stuff, right? Now we've covered some of the weapons, it's time to have a look at general design philosophy for the vessels in BioWar. With bioweapons being able to disperse spores and pluck crew from decks and turrets, a much heavier focus was placed on reducing crew exposure in combat. Most ships that could be dry docked and refitted had any turrets with open fighting compartments removed, replaced with any appropriate airtight counterparts. Similarly, some weapons became relatively obsolete due to the nature of the enemy. With bioweapons able to swallow and eat torpedoes, most Allied and Soviet ships had their torpedo tubes removed, being replaced with more guns or heavier armour. Finally, and some may say more crucially, bioweapon naval presence was extremely limited, even to begin with, resulting in a change of duties for most vessels. Ships that could be were refitted with anti-aircraft or dual-purpose armaments, giving them the necessary capability to prevent air raids or strikes on friendly units. As we will see, some ships were even modified to be used as missile launch platforms. It is also important to take note that a lot of older classes of ship became more vital, being needed to fill the gaps in Allied and Soviet fleets. Okay, the bit you have all been waiting for. Now, I could just whittle on forever, but I decided you may want something a little bit different. For anyone that hasn't noticed by now, a lot of this video was inspired by an old favourite game of mine, Battle Station Specific. Anyway, a 1947 modification to the Crown Colony class, HMS Jamaica was the first ship of her class to undergo refit. With her stern guns removed, an experimental Lopwing missile launch rail was mounted, along with the crane necessary to load the weapons in place. Bridge components were also reinforced and sealed, with most turrets being converted to be fully airtight where possible. HMS Jamaica was also equipped with a Saunders Roe SRA/1 seaplane jet fighter for self-defence and reconnaissance. With further advances in missile and rocket technology, the Allied powers needed a way for their ageing navies to engage targets further away than ever before. With American advancements in rocketry, the damaged but salvageable HMS Rodney was selected to test rocket launches into Germany. Though an early carrier design, the remaining Centaur-class carriers were only slightly modified for their war against the bioweapons. With an enclosed turret replacing the two lightly armoured front cannons and a new complement of aircraft, these carriers were ready to continue the fight. Arriving late to the war against the Germans, Vanguard arrived just in time to help beat back the bioweapon hordes. Modified with French-designed enclosed anti-air turrets and new radars, HMS Vanguard became the flagship the Royal Navy desperately needed. Having survived the war thus far, HMS Jervis was updated to serve on the front lines against the terror of bioweapons. With a newly sealed bridge and enclosed turrets, her torpedo mounts were replaced with additional turrets. By January of 1947, Jervis was ready for her new anti-air duties. Originally a ship of the Clemson class, HMS Bradford was hastily converted into an anti-aircraft platform during the Second Blitz. Using naval flak rocket launchers, Bradford also had her torpedo launchers replaced with Bofors mounts. Unlike other ships, Bradford does not have an enclosed bridge. Recalled for refit in early 1945, HMS Indomitable was already undergoing rearmament when the bioweapons were unleashed. Indomitable became one of the first Royal Navy ships to be declared safe for combat against the creatures. She also sports state-of-the-art aircraft components. With very little modification required, the USS Lexington was capable of carrying the latest US Navy aircraft. In addition, a launch platform for Little Joe missiles was added for additional anti-air protection. Modified to test the US JB-2 missiles, USS Fargo had her stern guns removed in order to house a storage and command centre for the weapons. Fargo was also equipped with the latest modification of the KAN Little Joe surface-to-air missiles. With the Japanese surrender to US forces in 1945, any repairable or serviceable ships from the Japanese fleets were sent to Europe. Ton was raised in 1946 and rearmed with Italian-designed enclosed secondary turrets. In early 1947, her seaplane deck was replaced with facilities for experimental Lopwing missiles. I do apologise if I'm pronouncing any of these wrong, by the way. Laid down near the beginning of the war, Chihaya was modernised with the help of US aid after Japan's surrender in 1945. With modernised and enclosed turrets, this ship acts as the premier recon vessel for Allied fleets. JDS Hatsukari. Captured by the British before the Japanese surrender, the Hatsukari was returned to the Japanese in mid-1945. This ship underwent a refit to include facilities for launching JB-2 missiles. But that isn't all. Though we have a plentiful collection of vessels there, you'll notice there is one major power missing from this roster, the USSR. While the Soviet Navy left something to be desired, nothing much changed there, Soviet engineers came up with some ingenious ways to keep their navy relevant. At least in the BioWar universe anyway. Though many of these aren't mentioned in the books, I did go ahead and design them anyway, so let's take a look. A 1945 modification of the K-class to include a launch ramp for Soviet 10kh missiles. Submarines such as these were used to launch strikes against bioweapon positions near to the coast. With the delays in developing the Sverdlov-class cruisers, the Soviet Navy needed an interim design to defeat the bioweapons. The result was a modification of the Kirov-class cruisers to include up-to-date turrets and 10kh missile launch rails to replace outdated torpedoes. Though extremely outdated even by the start of the war, this Soviet dreadnought would still see service. Modified with improved radar, 10kh rocket launch rails and improved anti-air defences, her main guns remained, being useful for killing targets at what would now be considered short to medium range. Attempting to mimic the naval air power of the Western Allies, the Kalinin was converted to carry experimental Rato and RAL-equipped fighters and torpedo bombers. Using both disposable rockets and arrestor hooks, Kalinin was forced to operate well within Soviet supply lines in order to launch effective sorties. During a daring raid in early 1945, Soviet Special Forces boarded the abandoned, half-finished Graf Zeppelin, evading bioweapon ships and heading for friendly waters. As the Soviets' first dedicated aircraft carrier, she is armed with the newest jet bombers, navalised Yak-9 fighters and Soviet-built weaponry and radar. The Graf Zeppelin raid is a crucial piece of Soviet naval history in the BioWar universe, and if enough people are interested, I will dedicate a video to this event. Though, just to point out, it's definitely not the first time the Russians stole an aircraft carrier. That's right, it's time for a little more timeline divergence, along with some wacky ships to go with it. Brace yourselves, Navy nerds. When the bioweapons turned on the Germans, its population was forced to flee, along with the Allied and Soviet troops within the country. Those that fled west would eventually be the founders of West Germany, while those that linked up with Soviet forces would become, you guessed it, East Germany. German units fleeing east were able to salvage a number of ships for the evacuations, and these would soon be incorporated into the Soviet Navy with German crews. Z-25. When the Soviets began the creation of an East German military in 1945, several serviceable German ships were refitted with Soviet weaponry, Z-25 included. While unable to house her own, Z-25 is equipped to resupply and refuel Soviet seaplanes. Prince Eugen. Taken by the Soviets in 1945, Prince Eugen was stripped of her main armaments in accordance with the German surrender conditions. With an East German crew, the ship was rearmed to test superguns well into the 1950s, before finally being scrapped. Nuremberg. Having evaded bioweapon infection, somehow, Nuremberg was taken by the Soviets for use in the new East German Navy. With her weaponry replaced by Soviet counterparts, her seaplane catapult was replaced with a crane capable of resupplying Soviet flying boats. Yeah, anyway, that's it. Bye. Oh, you was expecting more? Alright, fine. My plans for upcoming videos are a little in the air at the moment, so you'll need to give me some time while I work out what comes next. Though I have touched on it before, I would like to have a video dedicated to aircraft as well, since there are some fascinating designs I'd like to share. But for now, I'll roll the credits and show off some art that's been done recently. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.